Psychosis is something that we're not very good at understanding these days. We are very poor at understanding psychosis. And the reason for this is undoubtedly because we are such a rational culture. And rationality, or logic, has absolutely no time for psychosis or patience for psychosis. It writes it off. So what we tend to do is write off psychosis. We write it off as an aberration. And so the way in which we understand psychosis is to label it as an illness or a pathology or some kind of error signal emanating from the brain. And what this means is that we have zero interest in the content of psychosis. We're interested enough in a kind of a way in labeling psychosis as psychosis, but in doing this we automatically lose all interest in the content, because for us psychosis means nonsense, and we're not interested in nonsense. We're only interested in nice logical stuff that makes sense to the rational mind. And the problem with this is that stuff that makes sense to the rational mind is pretty damn boring when it comes down to it. The rational mind only understands a very narrow little section of reality. And while it's undoubtedly very useful for living our day-to-day lives, it's not useful for addressing the bigger picture of things. So it's pragmatically useful, just as a can opener is pragmatically useful for opening a can. Or at least it was back in the days when cans didn't come with little things, little tabs that you could open them with. In which case, back in those days, the can opener is pretty useful because it's damn hard opening a can without them. And the thinking mind is exactly like this. It's extremely useful and has to be respected in this way. But for sure it can't tell us anything about deeper matters or the bigger picture of things. It's never supposed to do that. That's not its job to do that. So the fact that we insist on looking at psychosis through the incredibly narrow lens of rationality is bizarre, to say the least. In the past, we had a greater understanding of the mythological realm as opposed to what we could call the rational, commonsensical, everyday realm. The mythological realm tells us far more about the human condition than rational psychology ever could, as Joseph Campbell said, and as I'm sure lots of other people said as well. If you happen to have a very extensive, rich knowledge of mythology, then your understanding of psychosis would be immensely enhanced. In actual fact, you would have an understanding of psychosis, whereas to the rational mind, psychosis, as I've just said, doesn't mean anything and is annoying or an insult. It's actually something rationality finds distasteful, of course, just as the commonsensical person finds flights of fancy distasteful, or poetry distasteful, or anything of that kind distasteful. And the only trouble is that life itself, or reality itself, isn't a rational object. It actually reality itself belongs to the realm of the mythological and the realm of the metaphorical. So if we could see that, we might open our eyes a little bit. Everything is a symbol. Or as Goethe said, all of these transient things that we can't hold on to, they're only symbols for something else. They don't have a final reality in themselves. So if we did have a more mythological view of psychosis, what would we see? What could we say about psychosis? And we would say, the first thing we'd say is that it is extraordinarily rich in meaning, and that its meaning resonates with lots and lots of mythological ideas and motifs that have appeared throughout history, as Carl Jung said. And I guess Carl Jung is a very good example of someone whose knowledge was incredibly extensive with regard not just to mythology, but to literature and religion and philosophy and the classics, which is what made him good at understanding the process that was going on with his patients. And by the same token, that's what makes the modern rational psychologist so very, very poor at that job. Which isn't to say that all modern psychologists are rational, but that is the predominant current. You don't get through the system that teaches us to be psychologists without being purely rational in our outlook. We take that stamp, that culture stamp. We live in a rational culture, and we want our psychology to reflect that rational outlook. And so psychology really is a symptom of our particular narrow culture rather than anything else, which is very incurious. Just wants to write everything off. Rationality always wants to write everything off. It doesn't like riddles, it doesn't like mysteries. For the rational mind, a mystery or a riddle is an irritation, something that needs to be solved, and if we can't solve it, it's an ongoing thorn in our flesh, and we don't like it. The rational mind doesn't like enigmas, and its never-ending task is to convert the enigmatic into the non-enigmatic. And yet psychosis is profoundly enigmatic, and we can't get rid of that enigmatic quality without losing the gist of what psychosis actually means, or what is in psychosis. It used to be a thing that back in the 80s people used to talk about reductionism a lot. It's the kind of thing you'd write in an essay. You'd write about reductionism. I guess you could say it's kind of a fashionable thing. To suddenly realise that science and lots of other modes of rational thought have reduced everything down to a very simple level, as if what they're talking about can be explained in terms of a simple level, which is again this thing of explaining away, or nothing butism, as Jung calls it. Why, it's nothing but. You see all this fantastic stuff, and the mind cuts in. That's nothing but, etc., etc., etc. So you can bring nothing butism into play, and then that is reductionism. So reductionism is another way of talking about it is to say that it is the bottom-up approach. So the bottom-up approach is where we kind of have all these little building blocks, all these little units, things that we know about, little Lego bricks or whatever they might be, and we understand them. We've got the grip on them, and so we see everything else as being understandable in terms of our understanding that we have of the building blocks. So if you understand the molecules, then you understand, say, an elephant or a giraffe or a budgerigar, because they're made of molecules. Now, even to say that sounds ridiculous, because we kind of know very well that no matter how expert you are in molecules, you could never infer a budgerigar or a kangaroo or a giraffe or a hippopotamus or an anteater. Like we kind of know that, really. It's just too absurd. If I happen to be a disembodied super intelligence studying molecules for millions and millions of years, getting to know all the properties and characteristics of atoms and molecules and subatomic particles in their uncombined form, just as a kind of a soup. So I could be discovering the properties of this soup and looking at this soup in my disembodied, hypothetical, abstract laboratory, and I still wouldn't come any closer to inferring a giraffe or a budgerigar, because giraffes and budgerigars aren't implicit in atomic structure. And whilst probably some people would maybe argue that they are, I think most of us would probably be happy enough to agree that they're not really, because it's just too absurd to imagine that they are. That would imply that there's kind of instructions there somewhere, some kind of code, God's own code, for how to go about constructing a giraffe out of all of these muons and prayons and heavy hadrons and all the rest of the soup, the electrons and the positrons and whatever else they are. Come with a little recipe. You stick them all together and Bob's your uncle. There's a giraffe here. And it's like a kit you could buy to assemble your own menagerie. So we know that's stupid. That's obviously stupid. So that points us in the direction of understanding the top-down approach. And the top-down approach essentially states that orders of complexity emerge as a result of interactions between lower levels of complexity, and these higher levels of complexity, i.e. more complex levels, have properties that in no way can be inferred from the lower level of complexity, because you can't infer a more complex reality from a less complex or simplex one. So what that means is the higher orders, and this isn't just a philosophical approach, it's the basis of complexity theory and chaos theory, and it's well established in the physical sciences. And even though it hasn't really caught the public imagination that much or filtered through to all the kind of disciplines such as biology so much, or psychology, if we can actually call that a discipline, but it hasn't filtered through because they're still very much bottom up. But the top-down approach or paradigm shows us that the most complex reality of all is already there, and that the forms of reality that we see around us are less complex analogues of the complex original, so that they're simplified down. So the whole physical universe can very obviously be seen as a simplified down version of the state of original symmetry, which is what modern physicists would see as being a starting off point for the universe. So the state of original symmetry is so complex we couldn't ever describe anything about it at all. Obviously we can't, because there are no dissymmetries in it, such as up and down, and left and right, and over here and over there, and less of and more of. And it's those symmetries which are used to describe everything. So in the state of original symmetry, you couldn't even begin describing anything. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's because we can't describe it. We might jump to the conclusion that if we can't describe it, then it can't exist. But that's only because we're thinking in a rational or bottom-up way. It would be smarter for us to look at it the other way and say, if we can describe it, then it obviously doesn't exist. Because what we can describe is a very, very oversimplified version of what we can't describe. And so we pulled it down to our level and made it understandable at the price of turning into an abstraction, and then abstraction isn't a real thing. Because reality isn't an abstraction. If reality was an abstraction, then we'd have to ask, what is it abstracted from? Which clearly shows us that we're talking nonsense, really, because abstractions are abstractions by virtue of the fact that they are abstracted from reality, and so reality itself cannot be an abstraction. We can only describe abstractions and understand them. So it's not too much to go from this to understanding that the heart of who we are, or our actual nature, is not an abstraction, is not a describable thing. And that the heart of what reality is, or the universe is also not an abstraction and not a describable thing. And yet at the same time, the process of entropy means that we do inhabit worlds which are simplified versions of original symmetry, and that can't really be denied, because they are dissymmetries in nature, and there are dissymmetries in the physical universe, and these dissymmetries are what we call the physical laws that physics is based on. But just because physics is based on constants and laws and dissymmetries doesn't mean that physics can't also see that there's a prior state which has none, which has no laws or constants. And that's okay. We can be okay about that. It's fine. What we're basically talking about is a collapse of multiple superimposed realities into a single black and white concrete reality, and that's very well understood to us now. That's been understood ever since quantum theory came on the scene. So what we can say is that the language we need to talk about the more complex realities, which don't have any literal reality. You can't say it's this or that, or it's a bucket, or it's a house, or it's a teapot, because they exist on multiple simultaneous levels, superimposed levels that are all true at the same time. They can't be described in literal or logical language. They can't be pinned down because their very nature is such that they can never be pinned down. But we can still talk about them, because we can talk about them in poetical language, in terms of metaphor, or in mythological language. And that's why mythology resonates for us in the remarkable way that it does. It's not some kind of bedtime story to put children to sleep. It's something to resonate with the core of us, which we've forgotten about because we're so fixated on rationality. So from saying that, we can then move on to say more about psychosis. And so this particular way of talking about psychosis relies on our understanding of the top-down paradigm. Normally, in everyday life, we exist in a simplified way. Everything makes sense in a literal way. Things are literally understandable. It's quite possible to go through life understanding everything literally. We can all think of people that do that more or less, and we can also acknowledge the fact that we do sometimes. Interestingly, when we become very, very afraid, not just normal fear but terror, we become very concrete in our way of looking at things. And when we use the favourite socially prescribed drug of Western civilization, we also become very concrete, very literal, very black and white minded. It's a very crude way of looking at things, but it kind of is functional in a way, because, as I have just said, a literal or concrete person can survive in the world to the fact that we can't appreciate the poetry of life, and the fact that what it says in Genesis was never meant to be literally understood, just as nothing in any of the wisdom traditions was ever meant to be literally understood, because they're metaphors. They're meant to resonate with a deeper level of awareness. Even though we don't have any poetry, we can't see the poetry in life, we can still get by. Most of us, we aren't stuck on the total literal level. We do have shades of ambiguity where we can see that things aren't quite what they're necessarily said to be, and that there is a kind of there are cracks in the rational edifice, and we do have a hint that there's more to life or more to the world than the rational mind would tell us. And we don't really focus on that, but that sense of there is more to life than just the bog standard rational description of it, it's what keeps us going. That's what makes us smile. That's what makes us laugh. If we were totally literal, we'd never laugh. Not properly. Not really. We'd have no sense of humour. The sense of humour comes from not being completely under the thumb of the thinking mind. But even so, even though we aren't totally literal, and we aren't totally concrete, we're pretty much concrete, pretty much literal when it comes down to it. So in this case, we can see that when an awareness comes to us, which is completely non-literal, completely not compartmentalized, where there are no black and white compartments that we can put the incoming data into, when it doesn't fit into any of our constructs, when the world that we perceive and see doesn't fit into any of our ideas of the world, our beliefs about the world, and we're overwhelmed by information that doesn't correlate to anything that we've believed to be true up to this point. So when that happens, that is a very good description of what we call psychosis. Okay, thanks for watching.